I greet you, ladies and gentlemen, even at this time, as I start the delivery of the lecture on literature review. In our previous lecture, we examined the introduction to literature review, and we covered some preliminary issues that are related to literature review. Today, what we want to cover in this installment of our research methodology course are the types of literature review. And we also want to look at the actual writing of literature review, the stages that are involved in coming up with literature review. So we'll start with the introduction to the types of literature review. It's very important that we start with covering briefly why a good literature review is important, and also we look at the purpose of literature review. Why is literature review so critical? I've been assisting students with research projects since 2005, which is approximately 2005 to 2022. It's around 17 years now of assisting students with literature review. I just started after 2 years after graduating my bachelor's degree. Before I even did my master's degree, as a tutorial assistant, I was assisting those who were undertaking their bachelor's degree programs at the university where I was working on a part-time basis to do their research projects. And one common thread that has recurred over the years, over nearly 2 decades of my work as an academic, is that I've observed that most students, they struggle to produce good literature review. Yet when we are looking at a research project, the pivot of the entire research is actually literature review. I know there is so much emphasis on research objectives and also on research methodology, that the methodology must speak to the research objectives. But without a thorough understanding of the existing literature, the trends and the patterns in the existing literature, it's almost impossible to produce a good literature review. So a literature review in its most basic form may consist of just a summary of key sources. But in the social sciences, it becomes imperative to have an organizational pattern or structure which combines both a summary and a synthesis with specific categories that the researcher or the student would have crafted in order to explore certain topical issues that impinge on their topic. So the purpose of conducting a literature review when someone is undertaking a study in a particular field is to trace the intellectual progression of knowledge in a particular field by examining the major debates that are prevailing, or controversies or theories that are still prevailing in a particular field. And depending on the situation, the student must evaluate the sources and advise the reader or examiner on the most pertinent or relevant research vis-a-vis their research topic or their main research problem. So it's important that the student comes up with the conclusion, what we call the conclusion before the conclusion, a summative statement, when they are just about to end their literature review term, where they clearly identify the knowledge gaps that exist vis-a-vis a certain research problem up to date. Stated in another way, after examining all the sources, after examining all the controversies, it behooves the student to identify for us as readers or as examiners or as supervisors the knowledge gaps that they would have identified in the theoretical and the empirical literature. What is the purpose of a literature review in a start? Why not just move from chapter 1 to research methodology? Or rather, why not start with research methodology? The purpose of literature review is, number one, to be in a position to place each work in its proper context in terms of its contribution to understanding the research problem which is being explored. It's very important that each work that the student is reviewing or that the student has reviewed or that the student has read is placed in its proper context in terms of its contribution to our understanding of the research problem that is being explored or studied by the student. That's the first purpose or reason for conducting a literature review. The second reason, it is to give us a description of the relationship of each work to other works, because the literature, it may appear to be, unrelated or to be operating at different ends of the spectrum when it comes to a particular research problem, but there is a way in which we can relate to the literature. So literature review assists us to be in a position to relate to the literature that the student is anchoring their research on. And then the third reason for conducting a literature review is to identify new ways to interpret prior research. When the student is undergoing literature review, or when a researcher is undertaking, literature review, a student is able to identify new ways of interpreting prior research, existing research, or information in the extant literature. And then the fourth reason for undertaking literature review is to reveal any gaps that exist in the literature, which is the point that I alluded to earlier on. And then the next reason is to resolve conflicts amongst seemingly contradictory studies that form part of the extant literature that the student will be reviewing in undertaking a particular study or in exploring a certain research problem. And then the next reason is to identify areas of prior scholarship to prevent duplication of effort. Because a student might think that they've found a new area and they've found a new problem when they are merely duplicating what has been done by so and so in another continent and at another time. So, and then the seventh reason for undertaking literature review is to point the way in fulfilling a need for additional research. It's to build a case that will convince us why this research is being undertaken, the existing research, or the research that the student will be undertaking. And then the eighth reason is to be in a position to locate one's research within the context of extant literature or existing literature. This is the most important reason, or one of the most important reasons. So to recap this content on the purpose of literature review, number one, it is to place each work, it might be a journal article, it might be a bulletin, it might be a newspaper article, whatever work one is looking at in its proper context in terms of its contribution to our understanding of the problem that the student is exploring or researching on. Second reason is to provide a theoretical or sometimes an empirical description of the relationship of each work to other people's work vis-a-vis the research problem. Third reason is to identify new ways of interpreting evidence in the existing literature or in prior research. Fourth reason, to reveal any gaps that exist in the empirical literature. The student will be in a position to point out gaps that exist either in terms of research methodology, in terms of findings, or in terms of both research methodologies and findings, as well as conclusions. Fifth reason, to resolve conflicts amongst seemingly contradictory previous studies. So the purpose of literature review is to harmonize evidence where it can be harmonized, to come up with statements of convergence or divergence between the literature that the student will be looking at or comparing. Sixth reason, to identify areas of prior scholarship or research in order to prevent duplication of effort or duplication of work. Seventh reason in this recap is to point the way in fulfilling a need for additional research and to locate one's research within the context of the empirical, both empirical and theoretical literature, or just within the context of the extant literature. So we move on to types of literature review. What I'm going to do, I'm going to mention initially 6 types of literature review, and then I'll go to covering all the 14 of them, because there are 14 types of literature review. The 6 types of literature review having been summarized by the University of Southern California as the most important types of literature review. But in my view, as an academic, out of the 14 types of literature review, we cannot really say which type of literature review is more important than the other. Many times, when researchers are reviewing literature, they just blend different approaches to literature review. So I will cover what I can call the first 6 in this installment. And in my next video, I'm going to cover the 14 types of literature review. And the modus operandi is to cover these 14 different types of literature review in terms of their label or their name, a brief description or definition of the type of literature review, how to classify it in terms of search, and how to appraise it, how it is conducted in terms of synthesis, and how it is conducted in terms of analysis. So we'll go to the 6 types of literature review as a way of introducing the 14 types of literature review. The first type of literature review is what is known as the argumentative review. This form of literature review functions in this way. It zeroes in on the arguments, the deeply embedded assumptions, or the philosophical problems or postures of established literature in the research area. So within a research area, you look for influential scholars. You check the arguments that they espouse, the assumptions that embed their arguments or that embed their theory or their theoretical positions. The purpose of this kind of literature review is to develop a body of literature that establishes a contrarian viewpoint. So when you look at social sciences, of which finance and economics and banking as well as social sciences, you realize that there is quite a lot of normativism, if I may put it that way. Or social sciences, they tend to be value-laden in nature. So there are a lot of arguments, especially when you're investigating issues to do with policy, be it fiscal policy or monetary policy. You realize that there's a lot to do with the value-laden statements or value-laden propositions or postulations. And as a result, you realize that there's a lot of argumentation which takes place in order to legitimize or delegitimize certain choices or options of policymakers. So this type of literature review is especially important when evaluating policies or evaluating procedures, where many procedures can be adopted and they can be sufficiently defended. And then number two, we have got the integrative review. This integrative review is a form of research that reviews, critiques, and synthesizes representative literature within a particular topic or a broad area, such that new frameworks and perspectives on a research topic are actually generated. So you don't narrate or regurgitate the literature, but the student embarking or the researcher embarking on integrative review, they actually carry reviews, critiques, and the synthesis of literature which they feel, in their estimation, is representative of the literature in a particular topic area that they would have chosen. So the body of literature would, in this case, include all prior studies that can be threaded together, either in terms of assumptions or in terms of research hypotheses. So the aim of this kind of integrative literature is to provide the reader or the examiner a well-done integrative review, which meets the same standard as primary research with regard to three main parameters, which are clarity, intellectual rigor, and replication. Our ability to replicate prior studies, or the ability of the researchers in the past to replicate what was done by others. And then number three, we've got what is known as the historical review. There is nothing in life which exists in isolation or in splendid isolation. There is normally historic precedent in whatever we'll be reading or examining as researchers. In other words, a phenomenon which is being investigated, it's highly likely that in its primitive or parent form, it was investigated by someone or by a certain group of scholars. So when we are examining an issue, concept, theory, or phenomenon that has just emerged, through literature review, we are able to trace the evolution of this new phenomenon, concept, theory, or phenomenon, which has just emerged. We are able to trace its evolution from other phenomena that have been studied by other people. The purpose is to place research in its proper historical context so that we are able to see familiarity, if it exists, of this phenomenon which is being studied, so as to avoid departing too much from the existing literature when the problem at hand actually is just a logical progression of problems that existed in the past, or the theory or concept at hand is just a progression of theories or concepts that actually existed in the past. And then we've got the methodological review. This is one area which is very critical. When students are presenting, material in their research methodology chapter, it's very imperative that they know how to blend a description of how the study was conducted with a thorough review of literature. When it comes to the research methodology section, what does the research methodology section say about your population of study? What does it say about your research design? What does it say about your research instruments? What does it say about the econometric model that you are implementing? What does it say about the variables that you have specified? What does the extant literature say about the signs that you expect to exist among different variables in your model's formulation or explanation? For us to have a complete ontological and epistemological picture, it's very imperative that the proposed research methodologies, they flow from research methodologies that have been implemented by other people in the past. Modern studies, sometimes in the social sciences, they integrate both quantitative and qualitative research. Thus, we may see the use of different sampling techniques, the use of self-administered questionnaires or questionnaires that are sent via email, the use of either face-to-face or non-face-to-face interviews, like telephone interviews or Skype interviews. And there may be either just ordinary data analysis or at very advanced and rigorous data analysis, which may be mediated by softwares. But the key point is that there is literature which must anchor any research methodology that is postulated or implemented by a student. And then number 5, we've got a systematic review. With a systematic review, we expect it to comprise of an overview of existing evidence, which is pertinent to a clearly formulated research question. So from a broad research area, or a research topic, the student is able to formulate a research aim or the main research objective. From that main research objective, the student is able to formulate a research question. So evidence must be adduced, existing evidence must be adduced, which is pertinent to that clearly formulated research question. Let us assume the student is investigating the relationship between gross investment and economic growth in Zimbabwe from 1980 to 2021. So it's very clear that the broad research question is, what is the relationship between gross investment and economic growth? We may add in Zimbabwe or we may not add it, so that we can accommodate whatever we'll be reviewing, either in the theoretical or in the empirical literature. So now the literature review will start from when this problem started to be investigated. What problem? The relationship between gross fixed capital formation or gross investment on the one hand and gross domestic product or changes in gross domestic product or economic growth on the other hand. So the student will identify and critically analyze all literature which is relevant, including reports, bulletins, and any other type of data that may assist the student to formulate a systematic and clearly defined picture of the phenomenon that they will be investigating. In this case, the extent to which gross investment affects or contributes to economic growth. And then number 6, we've got the theoretical review. Basically, in most literature review chapters, what I've observed is that there is the introduction, there is the theoretical or conceptual review section, there is the empirical review section, there is the third section where knowledge gaps are identified, and then finally we've got the conclusion. So there are 3 parts to literature review. In general, generically, we have got the theoretical or the conceptual, which must start, because we need to know before you present empirical evidence, the assumptions and the the assumptions and the hypotheses, as well as theories that underpin certain relationships according to the literature, before you actually present empirical evidence. In that way, we're able to follow empirical evidence. Why they to undertake those studies in the countries or polities or scenarios wherever they undertook those studies. So with the theoretical review, the aim is to concretely examine the corpus of theory that has been accumulated over time with regard to an issue, a concept, a theory, a phenomenon, or a process that is being studied. The theoretical literature review helps to establish what theories already exist so that we don't duplicate and think we've discovered a new theory when we are rehashing something which already exists in the literature. And the relationships that exist among the key variables in a particular, as identified by a particular theory, and the degree to which existing theories have been investigated by other researchers, and to develop new hypotheses that are worth testing. This form of literature review is very imperative in helping us to establish gaps in knowledge, gaps in the existing literature, able to see how current theories are inadequate in explaining the phenomenon that the student will be studying. So in this installment of my coverage of literature review, I have covered the preliminary and the most important part of literature review, as well as introduced the six what are considered by the University of Southern California to be the 6 main types of literature review. But as I said, there are actually 14. And so in the next video, I'm going to cover the 14 different types of literature review and also delve into how literature review is actually conducted in practice, how literature review is actually written. How does one write the literature review chapter? The mechanics, what I call the mechanics of writing literature review. I believe this presentation has benefited you. Thank you so much for watching the video. I encourage you to subscribe and to share the video with those of your colleagues who are also undertaking research.